It was noon when the first crack of a rifle echoed from the ridge. One sound, then a chorus. Olive trees snapped and bent beneath the windless percussion of gunfire. The 39th Infantry Regiment of the U.S. Army, weary and dust-caked, pushed forward through a narrow valley toward the town of Troina. Some said it was just another hill to take, but the men who fought there would later call it the Hill of Thirst. A young corporal named Harold Dean, 22, Kansas wheat farmer before the war, crawled on his stomach through brittle grass. His canteen sloshed faintly with what little water was left. The heat pressed down on his helmet, each breath tasting of rust and soil. Around him, men muttered prayers, curses, and commands, voices stripped to instinct. They had been fighting for days, trading fire with the Germans dug into the rocks above. The enemy held the high ground, snipers hidden among the terraced vineyards, machine guns stitched into stone walls like wasps in a nest. When the order came to advance, no one really believed it. Yet they went, stumbling uphill through bursts of dust that spat from the earth around them. A medic shouted for a stretcher. Someone yelled for morphine. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the world went quiet. No bullets, no shouting, only the drone of flies and the clink of metal cooling in the sun. Dean lifted his head. The ridge was littered with figures, some in gray, some in khaki, most still. The smell of cordite and burned grass hung in the air. He glanced at his canteen, then toward a shape lying face down a few yards ahead. The uniform was unmistakable. Feldgrau wool, black boots, a torn patch where an eagle once perched above a swastika. The man's hand twitched once, then went still. "Don't go near him," someone called. "Could be a trap." Dean hesitated. He'd heard the stories. Wounded Germans waiting for help, then pulling grenades. But he'd also seen something else these past weeks. Men dying for lack of water before they even bled out. He crawled closer. The German was young, maybe 19, with a face cracked from the sun, a thin line of blood across his lip. His canteen had been shot clean through. The soil beneath him was dark where the water had spilled. Dean unscrewed his own cap and tilted the canteen. "Easy now, buddy," he murmured. "Just a sip." The German's eyes fluttered open, blue, unfocused. His lips moved but no sound came. Dean lifted his head gently, pressing the metal rim to his mouth. The water ran out too fast. Half of it spilled onto the ground, but the man swallowed once before fainting again. Down the slope, others watched in disbelief. Private Joe Caruso, a New Yorker with a crooked grin, muttered, "You lost your damn mind, Dean." The medic beside him didn't answer. He just stared. In their training, mercy wasn't forbidden. It simply wasn't mentioned. There was always another fight coming. But word spread fast. Within an hour, more Americans were crossing the line, giving water to German wounded. Some tied makeshift tourniquets. Others carried stretchers improvised from rifle slings and shirts. There was no fanfare, no speeches. Only the steady rhythm of boots and breath in the heat. By late afternoon, the medics had gathered nearly a dozen wounded Germans at the base of the hill. Among them was a sergeant with shrapnel in his leg, whispering thanks through clenched teeth. Another wept openly, clutching the hands of the men dressing his wound. They had expected death. Instead, they received water. The Americans were exhausted too. They shared their rations without being told. They worked in silence, each man understanding something had shifted, something beyond orders or rank. Even the chaplain, his sleeves rolled up, wiped sweat from a German's brow and muttered a prayer in English none of them could understand. Later, as twilight spread over the valley, a column of prisoners was led away toward the rear. Dean sat on a rock, staring at the last inch of water in his canteen. Around him, men joked weakly about how they'd just made friends with the enemy. But there was no laughter, not really. The battlefield was too quiet, too heavy. That night, he dreamed of the boy's face, the one who had swallowed water and fainted again. He dreamed of his own father back in Kansas, who used to say, "Son, even a wounded dog deserves mercy." Dean had never thought much of it until now. At dawn, the smell of coffee drifted through camp. The unit was preparing to move again, north, toward another ridge, another fight. A lieutenant approached Dean, tapping the canteen hanging empty from his belt. "You gave yours away?" he asked. Dean shrugged. "Didn't seem right not to." The officer looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "Keep that with you. Maybe the world will remember it someday." The men marched on, boots scraping dust, rifles slung over shoulders. Behind them, in the valley they just crossed, the medics finished burying the dead, Americans and Germans alike, marking the graves with the same small wooden crosses. By afternoon, word of what had happened spread through nearby units. Some dismissed it as sentimentality. Others quietly admired it. But the story did not end there. Among the German wounded transported to Allied field hospitals, several would later be shipped to POW camps in North Africa, then the United States. They would speak of it often, in disbelief, that the Americans, even in the middle of hell, had given them water before giving them chains. In one transport truck rattling through the dust, a young German whispered to another, "They treated us like men." The other didn't reply. He was still staring at the canteen in his lap, dented where a bullet had grazed it, its metal cool against his palms. Back on the Sicilian ridge, Dean and his company climbed toward their next objective. The sun beat down again, relentless and familiar. He took a new canteen from supply, filled it to the brim, and slung it at his side. The water sloshed softly as he walked, a reminder, a promise, or perhaps a question he hadn't yet learned to answer. The wind carried the faint scent of wild thyme and smoke. Somewhere behind them, a chaplain knelt by a grave and whispered, "Blessed are the merciful." Dean didn't hear it. He just kept walking, boots crunching in the dust, the echo of gunfire already fading into memory. Yet something lingered in the silence, the memory of a small act, absurd and profound, born of thirst and mercy. And though no one could have known it then, that moment on a nameless hill would travel farther than any bullet ever fired. The sea wind that reached Sicily carried the smell of salt, diesel, and something older, the scent of Europe cracking open. Weeks after the battle near Troina, the men of the 39th Infantry had changed. They still joked, still cursed the heat, still wrote letters home on scraps of paper, but a quiet weight now lived behind their eyes. What they'd done that afternoon, sharing water with the enemy, had begun to circle through the ranks like a rumor no one quite knew how to handle. Some called it compassion, others called it foolishness, but in a war built on dehumanization, mercy was the strangest weapon of all. Corporal Harold Dean marched with his company down a narrow road lined with burned-out trucks. The landscape was a patchwork of stone walls and wheat fields flattened by shellfire. He had new orders and a new canteen, but every time he reached for it, he remembered the German boy's cracked lips, the way his trembling hands had clutched the metal like a sacred thing. War had been sold to them as a clear line, enemy or ally, good or evil, but Dean now saw only shades of dust. That night, while cleaning his rifle, he spoke quietly to Joe Caruso. The New Yorker grinned the same grin he used for everything, even fear. "You know, Kansas," he said, "word is the Krauts are calling us saints now." Dean didn't smile. "You ever think it's backwards?" he asked. "We kill 'em all day, then give water to the ones still breathing." Caruso shrugged. "Guess that's the deal. You fight like hell, but you don't forget you're human." Nearby, the company chaplain wrote in his small leather notebook by lantern light. He had seen the same contradiction, men capable of both cruelty and grace within the same breath. In his entry, he wrote, "It is strange how mercy confuses soldiers more than bullets." Days later, they moved through villages still trembling from the invasion. Old women offered figs in cracked bowls. Children stared at the Americans with cautious wonder. In one courtyard, a German prisoner was sweeping rubble while an American guard leaned against a wall, smoking. The prisoner glanced up and said in halting English, "Your men, they gave water. In Germany, we were told you would shoot us." The guard exhaled smoke and replied softly, Maybe your news was wrong." That brief exchange summed up what even generals couldn't explain. Propaganda had prepared them for monsters, but not for mercy. German command reports later recorded disbelief that captured soldiers had been treated humanely by American forces. Some officers dismissed it as weakness. Others quietly feared what such decency might inspire among their own. The contrast between the two armies ran deeper than tactic. German troops had been raised in a world of absolute obedience, drilled to follow orders even when their conscience rebelled. Americans were different. They came from towns where a man could argue with his mayor and still shake his hand at church. Their army wasn't built on fear. It was built on a stubborn belief that right and wrong still mattered, even under fire. When medics set up aid stations after each battle, they didn't ask for uniforms first. They treated the bleeding, regardless of color or insignia. Lieutenant Robert Gaines, a field surgeon from Missouri, later said in an interview, "A wound is a wound. You close it. You don't check which flag they fought under." His medical tent saw both Americans and Germans lying side by side, morphine easing moans into sleep. Dean watched it once, an American medic kneeling beside a German paratrooper who had lost an arm. The medic gave him water, cleaned the stump, and whispered something the translator didn't bother to repeat. The paratrooper cried silently, and Dean turned away, feeling a strange guilt that he couldn't name. Even as mercy spread through small acts, it met quiet resistance. Some soldiers scoffed that compassion dulled their edge. They had lost friends, seen ambushes, dug graves too shallow for peace. One sergeant spat, "You can't win a war with kindness." Yet those same men carried wounded prisoners to the rear when the fighting stopped. They grumbled about it, but they still did it. The contradiction became part of who they were, warriors haunted by their own decency. At night, the camp filled with music from a harmonica someone had found in a captured truck. The notes drifted over tents like a lullaby for men who couldn't sleep. Under the moonlight, Dean wrote a letter to his mother. He didn't mention battles or medals. He wrote about the German boy who couldn't speak but drank from his hand. He ended the letter with one line, "It's strange, Mama, sometimes kindness feels heavier than hate." The next morning, orders came for transport. The division would move north toward Messina, and the wounded, both American and German, would be sent to the ports for evacuation. Dean volunteered to help load them. He watched as prisoners were placed in trucks beside the same medics who had treated them. No one spoke much. The engines hummed, the smell of fuel mixed with iodine, and the horizon shimmered like a dream half-remembered. As the trucks rolled out, one German sergeant raised his hand weakly in salute. It wasn't mockery or surrender, it was gratitude. Dean nodded back. In that brief gesture, an entire ideology cracked. Later that week, reports from intelligence officers reached headquarters. Captured Germans were describing the Americans not as savages, but as strange men of mercy. It confused Berlin's propaganda ministry so much that they ordered their field commanders to emphasize American brutality in the next broadcast. But the truth had already traveled faster than radio waves, by word of mouth, from soldier to soldier, across the front. As the days wore on, the Americans learned something unexpected. Mercy, once given, returned in unexpected ways. A German sniper captured near San Fratello confessed that he had spared a U.S. patrol because he had seen them give water to my wounded brother. That confession made its way back to the 39th Infantry, passed quietly around the campfires. It wasn't official. It wasn't even verifiable. But it felt true, and that was enough. By mid-August, the Allied flag rose over Messina. Sicily was taken, though the war stretched far beyond the sea. The men of the 39th cleaned their weapons, packed their gear, and waited for transport to the next unknown shore. Yet beneath the routine, a new unease stirred, the sense that their mercy had changed them more than victory ever could. They had glimpsed humanity in the enemy, and now could never unsee it. One evening, as the sun burned low and red over the docks, Dean stood alone, watching German prisoners board a hospital ship bound for North Africa. He saw the boy again, the same one from the hill, walking with a crutch, his arm bandaged. Their eyes met across the distance. The boy hesitated, then lifted his hand in a small wave. Dean didn't move at first. Then he raised his canteen slightly, as if in a silent toast. The boy smiled, brief and tired, before disappearing into the crowd. For a long moment the world seemed still, the gulls circling, the water glinting like molten glass. The guns were silent, but the memory of them lingered. Dean turned away, the canteen heavy at his side, wondering if Mercy would survive the next battle, or if it would die in the noise like everything else. The sea voyage from Sicily to North Africa took 3 days, though for the wounded Germans it felt like a lifetime compressed into the groaning hull of a hospital ship. The air reeked of salt, iodine, and human breath. Nurses moved between cots like ghosts, their white uniforms flickering under swinging bulbs. Among the patients was a young corporal named Emil Kraus, the same boy who had once drunk from Harold Dean's canteen on that nameless hill. His leg was bandaged, his face still raw from the sun, but his mind was alive with disbelief. The enemy had given him water, not death. It was an idea so strange that he whispered it to the man beside him, as if it were blasphemy. "They helped us," he said in German. "The Americans helped us." The other soldier frowned. "You're delirious," he muttered. But Kraus only smiled faintly. "No. They were kind." That whisper became the first ripple. By the time the ship docked in Bizerta, word had already passed among dozens of prisoners. The Americans were not what the Reich had promised. They were rough, loud, and sometimes careless, but not cruel. From North Africa, the prisoners were transferred by air and sea to a world they'd only heard about in propaganda leaflets, America. The journey took them across the Atlantic, through storms that tossed their transport ships like toys. When the hatches finally opened, they saw green fields instead of barbed wire, oak trees instead of ruins. The guards were armed, yes, but they laughed easily, and some even offered cigarettes. The shock was immediate. At Camp Hearn in Texas, where thousands of German POWs were housed, the prisoners stepped from the trains expecting humiliation. Instead, they found barracks lined with bunks, a mess hall serving meat and coffee, and showers with running water. The desert air was hot but clean, and the sound of American country music drifted faintly from a radio near the gate. One officer muttered, "They're treating us better than Berlin treats our own civilians." For Emil Kraus, the first night was sleepless. He lay awake listening to the hum of crickets outside and the murmurs of disbelief inside the barack. Some men argued that it was all a trick, American manipulation designed to break their will. Others thought the Americans were fools, too soft for real war. But a few, like Kraus, said nothing. They remembered the canteens on the Sicilian hill, the medics, the hands that had bound their wounds. Days turned to weeks. Work details were assigned, clearing brush, repairing fences, harvesting cotton for local farms. The prisoners earned small wages they could spend on soap, stationery, or even Coca-Cola from the camp store. It was surreal. The same soldiers who had fought under the swastika were now drinking American soda and writing letters home that began, "Dear Mother, I am safe." Rumors moved faster than any guard could stop them. In Camp Shelby, they have a library. In Camp McCain, they play soccer every Sunday. In Hearn, they let us build a band. The whispers carried from camp to camp through Red Cross mail and truck convoys. Soon, the story of mercy on that Sicilian hill became part of the mythology of capture, a story retold around mess tables in a dozen variations. Some said it was a single canteen. Others claimed the Americans had lined up to give water to hundreds. The details blurred, but the essence remained. The enemy had shown compassion. The older prisoners, the officers, tried to suppress it. "Don't speak of it," they warned. "It weakens discipline." But the younger men kept talking. In the evenings, after lights out, they told the story to anyone who would listen, lowering their voices as if sharing a forbidden truth. One of them drew it in pencil on the back of a ration card, an American soldier kneeling beside a wounded man, a canteen between them. Across the ocean, Harold Dean never knew his act had become legend. He was now fighting in Italy, trading hills for rivers, victories for exhaustion. Yet in the Texas camps, his ghost, his gesture, was alive. One day, an American farmer named Walt Bishop arrived at Camp Hearn looking for field laborers. He was a stocky man with a sun-cracked face and a kind of practical decency the war hadn't touched. 5 Germans were assigned to his farm, including Kraus. They rode in the back of a truck past miles of cotton fields, their wrists loosely bound. When they reached the farm, Bishop cut the ropes himself. "You work better with free hands," he said. It was there, under the Texas sun, that the idea of enemy began to dissolve completely. The prisoners worked hard, sang German folk songs, and ate cornbread and beans alongside the Bishop family. On Sundays, they played soccer in the pasture, while Bishop's wife brought lemonade to the field. The neighbors shook their heads, feeding the enemy, but Bishop didn't care. "They're just boys," he said. "Same as ours." Kraus wrote home about it. His letter was censored but preserved enough to reveal the truth. "We are treated with respect. I was once dying of thirst in Sicily. Now I am alive because of them." That letter, like hundreds of others, slipped through the censor's net and landed in mailboxes across Germany, each one a small spark against the darkness of propaganda. Families who read them began to wonder if the enemy was really monstrous, or if something else had been monstrous all along. Within months, Red Cross officials visiting the camps reported a surprising transformation. Prisoners were calmer, more cooperative, even hopeful. Many requested English books, church services, and classes. Some learned carpentry. Others painted murals of Texas sunsets on the barrack walls. The guards watched, half amused, half amazed, as the camps became small islands of humanity in a world still on fire. Not everyone understood. A visiting colonel once scowled at the sight of prisoners eating pie. "You treat them too well," he said. The camp commandant replied quietly, "Sir, we treat them how we'd want ours treated." Still, beneath the surface calm, a tension grew. The war was far from over. News arrived daily. Bombings in Hamburg, battles in Italy, death camps liberated in the East. Some prisoners wept when they read it. Others refused to believe. But almost all of them spoke now with a different tone when they mentioned Americans. Not as beasts but as men who, against every instinct of war, had chosen decency. Years later, when interviews were conducted with former POWs, many traced their change of heart to that first moment of mercy. One recalled, "The water they gave us tasted like forgiveness." Another said, "They could have let me die. Instead, they taught me what honor really means." In Camp Hearn, as autumn rolled in, Kraus carved a small wooden figure during his off hours, a soldier kneeling with a canteen in his hand. He placed it on the shelf above his bunk and never explained its meaning. But the other men knew. On a cool night in October, the prisoners gathered outside to watch the American flag being lowered at sunset. For the first time, no one jeered. The bugle echoed over the barbed wire, soft and mournful. Kraus stood quietly, hat in hand, thinking of the man who had given him water. He never learned his name. As the last note faded, a guard called out the evening count. The prisoners filed inside, the gates clanged shut, and silence fell over the camp. Yet within that silence, a whisper remained, a whisper of mercy that had crossed oceans and outlived orders, waiting for the world to decide what it meant. The war ended not with thunder but with silence, the kind that hums in a man's ears when the shooting stops and the world doesn't yet believe it. By 1945, Harold Dean was a different man from the one who had climbed that Sicilian hill 2 years before. His uniform was faded, his face leaner, his hands marked by the kind of work that no farm could prepare a boy for. He'd seen Rome liberated, crossed into France, and stood in a Germany that looked more like a graveyard than a nation. The war was over, but its ghosts followed close behind. On his last morning in Europe, Dean packed his duffel and found the dented canteen at the bottom, the same one that had emptied into the mouth of a dying enemy. He turned it over in his hands, tracing the scratch where a bullet had grazed the metal. To most, it was just a relic. To him, it was a question that had never stopped echoing. What was the point of mercy in a world that kept inventing new ways to destroy itself? He sailed home on the USS General George M. Randall, surrounded by men who had already begun to speak of the war in past tense. They joked, gambled, and planned their futures. But Dean stood at the rail, staring at the Atlantic, the salt wind stinging his face. He thought about all those he hadn't saved, and the ones he had, German or American, it no longer mattered. War, he realized, was a place where good men proved who they were not when they fought, but when they stopped fighting. Thousands of miles away, in Texas, Camp Hearn was emptying. The war's end had set in motion the long process of repatriation. The prisoners were thinner but alive, packing up their hand-carved boxes, photographs, and small tokens of their strange American captivity. Emil Kraus was among them, now walking without a limp, his face older but his eyes still steady. In his satchel lay a letter he had written in careful English but never sent. It began, "To the soldier who gave me water." As the train carried him toward the coast, Kraus pressed his hand against the glass. He saw the cotton fields blur past and thought of the Bishop farm, of lemonade and music and laughter that had once seemed impossible. He didn't know if he'd ever return to this place, but he knew it had changed him more than the war itself. For the first time, he believed that mercy could defeat hatred, not with force but with permanence. When Kraus returned to Germany, he found his hometown a ruin of brick and ash. His father had been killed in an air raid. His mother was missing. He rebuilt what he could, working as a carpenter, and married a nurse who had tended the displaced. At night, he told her stories of Texas, of Americans who shared bread and kindness with prisoners. She thought he exaggerated, until he showed her the wooden carving of the kneeling soldier and said, "This man existed." In the years that followed, letters began to cross the ocean, some from former prisoners to American farmers, others between soldiers who had once been enemies. One day, in the summer of 1951, a small brown envelope arrived at Harold Dean's mailbox in Kansas. The handwriting was foreign but careful. Inside was a letter from Germany, written by Kraus. It began with gratitude, but what caught Dean's breath was the ending. "When I drink water, I remember the day I was given life by the one who could have taken it. I hope to meet you before we are both too old." Dean read it twice before setting it on the kitchen table beside his coffee. The world outside was quiet, the wheat swaying in the same rhythm as the sea once had. He didn't reply immediately. Some memories were too heavy for paper. But a week later, he wrote back, short and plain. It wasn't mercy. It was the right thing to do. The exchange continued for years. They wrote about harvests and winters, children and repairs. They never mentioned ideology or victory, only survival. When Dean's daughter married, he sent a photograph. When Kraus's first child was born, he sent a drawing of the canteen, shaded in pencil. Each man lived an ordinary life marked by an extraordinary understanding that decency, once given, never truly dies. By 1963, Camp Hearn's barracks had been dismantled. The desert reclaimed the land, leaving only concrete foundations and a plaque few stopped to read. Yet for those who had lived there, it remained sacred ground. That same year, Kraus, now a middle-aged craftsman, traveled to the United States with a group of former POWs invited by the Red Cross for a reconciliation ceremony. He requested one special stop, Kansas. When the black car pulled into Dean's driveway, the veteran was mending a fence post. He looked up, and for a moment neither man moved. Kraus stepped out, the years visible in the lines on his face, and held out his hand. "You haven't changed much," he said with a small, uncertain laugh. Dean smiled faintly. "You look better fed," he replied. Then, without another word, the two men embraced, awkwardly, like brothers who had never expected to meet again. They spent the afternoon walking the fields, talking about everything except the war. At sunset, Dean fetched the old canteen from a shelf inside his barn. Its metal had dulled with age, but the dent remained. Kraus touched it gently, his eyes glassy. "I've thought about this every day," he whispered. Dean nodded. "Me too." Before he left, Kraus filled the canteen from Dean's well and took a sip, the water cold and pure. Then he offered it back. "This time," he said, "I give it to you." Dean accepted it without speaking. In that simple exchange, 2 wars ended, the one between nations and the one inside their hearts. When Kraus returned to Germany, he carried no souvenirs except a photograph of Dean's farm and a small Kansas pebble he kept on his desk. He lived another 20 years, telling his children that mercy had once saved him and, in doing so, saved the world he hoped they'd inherit. Dean lived to old age too, quiet and steadfast. On his mantel, beside the flag folded from his service, stood the canteen and a letter now yellowed with time. Visitors often asked about it. He'd just smile and say, "That's my reminder that kindness isn't weakness. It's endurance." When he died in 1985, his daughter placed the canteen in his coffin, and somewhere across the Atlantic, the son of a former German soldier raised a glass of water in his honor. History rarely records such gestures. It counts tanks, treaties, and casualties. But the small things, the sip of water, the hand extended across barbed wire, these are what truly outlive war. They travel quietly, like whispers through generations, teaching those who listen that the cost of mercy is never too high. And if you listen closely enough, even now you might still hear it, the echo of that canteen being uncapped under a Sicilian sun, the sound of a man choosing to be human when the world had forgotten how. If this story moved you, give it a like, share it so others remember that even in war, kindness is stronger than hate. Subscribe for more true stories history almost forgot, and tell us in the comments what mercy means to you.